Hello, my name is Simon Strange. I've been a commercial video game designer for 23 years or so, since about 1998. I've shipped lots of games, mostly on console. I'm probably best known for the Godzilla games I did with Atari in the early 2000s. I've also worked on Tomb Raider, Prince of Persia, Army of Two, Tony Hawk, Rampage, Gems of War. But more importantly, for the purpose of this talk, in 2019, I started a PhD program at Abertay University, and when I complete that, that does mean that I will be Dr. Strange, which, of course, is awesome. So today, I'm going to be talking about a research project that I started at the end of 2019. This project isn't especially complex, but it is similar to a lot of things that it is not. And so I'm going to just try to make really clear exactly what I'm doing and what I'm not doing. And that can be a little bit challenging, but I promise there's nothing I'm saying here that's unusual or especially complicated. So with any sort of research project, you have to start with a question. And so the question I started with was, how can I help people buy board games that they are happy with? I'm a big board game collector. I have hundreds of board games, and I hate it when I buy a board game and I get home and I try to play with people and it's just not what I wanted, right? And sometimes games are disappointing, that's natural, but I especially hate it if I buy something and it's not what I thought it was going to be, right? I thought it was going to be, have certain attributes and it just doesn't have them, or it has some other attributes that I just hate, and I wouldn't have bought it if I'd known that that was present. So how can I help people make better informed decisions? Of course, there's a lot of discussion of board games. Board Game Geek especially has a whole bunch of sort of like mechanics and breakdowns, and they're talking about the pieces of what's inside a board game. But I, as a professional game designer, I'm going to say none of those things are very helpful. You can say things like, oh, this is a worker placement game. This is area control. This is deck building. All kinds of words that tell you useful things about how the game plays and how you interact with it. But I'm going to say that none of those things are especially useful in telling you whether or not it's the kind of game you like. Those factors are just like telling you the number of letters in the title, right? The number of letters in the title, there might be some correlations there. Maybe some very long titles mean something. Maybe 4 letters always means a later games thing. But I wanted to find factors that were really useful, that really gave you important key information that would let you make good decisions, right? So I want to apply that using some rigor and some math. Let me set the scene a little here, because I work with math a lot. I just do lots and lots of equations and calculations all the time. I use lots of spreadsheets. You're going to see a bunch of that. I'm very comfortable with numbers. But it's important to understand that math is just a description. It's a description of something that we've seen, something we've observed. The fact that we're using numbers to describe it doesn't make it any different fundamentally from, say, a poem, right? If there's a poem that's describing what it's like to be in love or to have a beautiful summer day, that's not different. That's just another way of describing things, right? And so math isn't more true. It isn't more correct or more accurate. It's just another method that humans can use to describe something that we're experiencing, right? So that's really important. The useful thing about math is that you can manipulate it. So if you have something that is mathematically true, you can find lots of other ways to say the same thing that are equally true, right? So if you start with an incorrect mathematical statement and you change it, it's still incorrect. If you start with a correct statement and you change it, it's still correct, but it can be presented in a different form, okay? So the fact that I'm using math and I'm subjecting this to scientific analysis and statistical analysis doesn't mean that anything I'm doing is more complete. In fact, there's often a lot of bias and a lot of assumptions that go into the mathematical models, and it's really important to try to tease those things out. And so that's why, as I said at the beginning, I'm going to be doing a lot of disclaimers about what I'm not doing. Because you can look at some of these things and say, oh, I think but it's really important to be really clear about what I'm trying to describe, because this is just a description, and it can only be accurate insofar as my description is of something that we understand. Great. So, that said, I did a survey, and let me talk about my survey a little bit. I created 20 poems, 20 factors, that's a bad word, 20 attributes that I have used to decide whether or not I want a game. So this is my document that was part of my survey that I gave out. I had some 350 responses to my survey. So this is one possible attribute of board games, okay? I call it malice. Some of these attributes are similar to things that people already have names for, similar to things that people already talk about. I'm deliberately choosing unusual words for them because I'm trying to get people out of their comfortable space. I don't want them to think, oh, I already know what that is. I want them to say, well, that's a little funny. What's that mean? So that they listen carefully, right? So I'm just reading off here. Malice is meant to represent the expected level of effort that players put into actively disrupting or eliminating their opponents. A 0 would be a fully cooperative game. A 4 represents a game in which players are actively making and betraying promises to one another within the spirit of the game. Note that co-op games with traders, like Shadows over Camelot or Battlestar Galactica, score as a 2 on this scale. Negative player interactions specifically refer to situations in which player A impedes player B's ability to score or gain resources or to act at all. Resource theft, quests, and eliminating pieces are all excellent examples of negative interactions. So, with all of these different attributes, I have a score that goes from 0 to 4. I like computer science, so I start numbering from 0. You could make it 1 to 5 if that's more comfortable for you. But often 0 specifically means the lack of that attribute, so I think 0 is clear. So this is a rubric. So a rubric is, if I'm thinking about some certain game, I should be able to look at this list and say, which of these things fits my game best? And there is a meta rule that is earlier in the survey, that if several of them seem to apply, you take the highest value, okay? So just reading through this rubric. A malice score of 0 means the game is fully cooperative. What is good for one player is good for all players, and players are actively trying to help one another to win the game. Pandemic is an excellent example of a 0 malice game. Malice 1. This game has no negative player interactions, but also does not allow players to assist one another. This is a game that you play in parallel, where there's almost no interaction between players at all. Snakes and Ladders is an excellent example. Perhaps Candyland. Right? We are racing, but what you're doing and what I'm doing, there's nothing I can do. I can't do any sort of smack talk. I can't do anything that hurts you. I also can't help you. 2, so this is the center value. This game has negative player interactions, often in the form of resource scarcity. Players are expected to be watching what other players do and adjust their strategy around those actions. The examples I list are Sorry, Shadows over Camelot, Dominion, Lords of Waterdeep. But honestly, I'd say probably 50% of all games fall into this category. There's a way you can interact with other players. If you're playing poker, and watching and seeing what other people are betting and thinking about the cards they have, because those are cards I don't have. If I'm going to be playing, any sort of miniatures or fighting game where I'm like changing what I'm doing based upon what other people are doing, that'll probably get me at a 2, right? So I could potentially play badly to help somebody win, or I could play aggressively and really focus on one player. That's puts me at a 2. Malice level 3. Players can be eliminated from the game. The victory conditions will often require this. The other players are your primary obstacle to victory. A risk is a good example here, also cosmic encounter. So this is an older style of game. It's not very popular these days, but this is a war game. This is something where your goal is not to end up with more points than other people. Your goal is to get rid of the other people, to actually eliminate them, to stop them, to destroy them in some way. Right? So Euro games would never hit a 3, right? One of the attributes when people say, oh, this is a Euro game, what they mean is you're not eliminating players from playing. You're not taking them out. You're trying to get these victory points through resource scarcity. Malice level 4. This game requires that players actively lie to one another. They will solicit favors and make alliances and make decisions under the constant threat of duplicity. So my examples here are diplomacy, or social games like Secret Hitler, or Coup, or The Resistance. So in these games, you have to lie to each other. Now, one of the things that people really like about board games, that I really like about board games, is that they have clear rules. And often, there's an assumption that anything that's not said in the rules is sort of up for grabs. So, in real life, I wouldn't lie to you. I wouldn't manipulate and deceive you, or if I did, I would know that that's not an okay thing to do. But sometimes there are games in which lying and manipulating people is the whole point of the game. And that can be a lot of fun if everyone understands that. If everyone knows, oh, this is a game in which we're all trying to lie to each other, that's the game. But it is extremely uncomfortable to play a game in which you are lying to one another. Someone doesn't understand that that part of the normal social contract has been suspended, right? The list diplomacy, I don't know if any of you played diplomacy, but diplomacy is a classic game where it's all just discussion and manipulation and alliances. And the way that generally you play diplomacy is that you are working with people and you are making alliances and you're doing what you said and you do not break your word until it is so advantageous to you that you betray somebody and stab them in the back, and it is awful and destroys friendships. It's a great game if everyone is on board with playing that sort of game. And man, if someone is a little bit unclear on how much you could betray each other, it's a game that absolutely destroys friendships. So that's Malice level 4. So importantly, there's no best value here. All values of Malice are really good values. They're all different kinds of games, but knowing the value of Malice for a board game tells you about the play of that game in a way that I think is really useful for how you're going to make a decision about whether or not that's the kind of game you want to buy, or that's the kind of game you want to play with a certain group of people. Great. That was my extensive discussion of one factor. There are 20 such factors in my survey here. Investment, fiddliness, imaginated, instability, attention, intricacy, and so on, and so on, and so on. There are 20. I'm not going to go through all of them. If you're interested, I can give you a link to all my Google Docs on this. So, I start with all these things. So, these are all interesting and good values, right? I've played a lot of games, I'm a game designer, I've come up with a bunch of things. But here's the thing, there isn't anything especially special about these 20, right? A big group of people, we could come up with hundreds of useful metrics that would all be valid, that would all be very useful, right? I'm not trying to make any sort of claims that the things that I've come up with, that I'm studying, are somehow better or more fundamental. That would be nonsense. These are just poems. I'm just describing things that I've seen, right? But I do have a question, and my question is, how can I help people make better decisions? And so, looking at these 20 metrics, doing my survey, I want to know what is the set of questions that are the most useful for helping the most people make a good decision about a board game. So for example, if intricacy, that's up on the screen now, if intricacy is something that people really care about, maybe that's a useful thing to put on the box, right? Maybe if malice is something that people have opinions about it, but they'll buy the game whether it's a 0 or 4 malice, then that's still useful information, but maybe they don't care about that at sort of the time of purchase, right? So, I take all these things and I start running them through analysis. So I had about 350 responses to my survey that I ran in January, February of 2020. And so this is a histogram, okay? A histogram is a type of analysis. It's just counting how many responses came in at each value, right? And so this question, so for every metric, there were 2 questions. The first question was, what's your preferred value, 0 to 4? Which one do you like the best? Which one do you want to, play at? The second question was, how much do you care about that? How much do you care that things have to be at your preferred value? So a 10 means I want to play 0 malice games and I only play 0 malice. A 1 means take any value of malice. I mean, I like 0. Whatever, they're all good. Okay. So this is about the allegiance. This is how much people value their preferred score of allegiance. That's what this histogram is about. And you'll see that very, very few people put a 9 or a 10. Very few people really care about the level of allegiance that's going on in their games. Some people didn't care much, those were on the left, but there was also definitely a bit of a spike of people who kind of care. They definitely have a preference, and they're not going to say, I won't play anything else, but they definitely have a preference, right? So the actual number of responses should absolutely be ignored, because the number of responses is only statistically relevant if I have a representative sample of all people, and I absolutely do not. I conducted this survey by sending out links through Twitter on various board game affiliation sites. I also passed it around to my friends, my family. So I have a lot of non-board gamers, but absolutely a strong number of people who took the survey are big board game nerds, right? A not at all representative of society. So in society, maybe 10% of people are huge board game nerds, and in my survey, maybe 60% of my responses were big board game nerds. Absolutely making those numbers up. So we don't want to be thinking that the distribution of answers in my survey represents the distribution of the world or reality. Absolutely not. However, as long as I have people from all sorts of different groups of play styles, it is still valid for me to look and sort of see how the different answers will tend to cluster, right? And so if I can identify like 4 or 5 clusters of answers, I can figure out what are the most important attributes for each cluster. And then that can be the set of information that we put on the side of a box to help people make better information. So because I don't have a representative sample, you'll probably see that certain clusters are going to be huge, overrepresented in my data set. That's totally fine. That doesn't at all invalidate the idea that I want to find out what are the most important questions for people looking at different things. Now, set the scene, let's get into the data. So here on the left, this is my list of the 20 factors that I put out. Now remember, I'm not saying that these are necessarily good or bad, although this data actually helps show me which ones maybe are more interesting or less interesting to people. And you could absolutely do this with all sorts of different factors, but these are the ones that I came up with. So this is an interesting step. So this is not my primary survey data. I put out a call for board game experts. Because in order to come up with my list of 20, I wanted to make sure that the scoring for each of them was clear. So I got a bunch of people who were all familiar with the top 100 games on Board Game Geek, just as a random group of games, and I asked them to score each of those games. And then we were looking here at the variance on their scores. So if a game, like Mechs and Minions, has a variance of 0, that means everybody, all of my experts, gave it identical scores for all 20 of these attributes. That's awesome. I would love to have all zeros in here. But as you can see, there were some areas that were a little bit problematic. So specifically, this one here, the game Codenames. A lot of variance in a whole bunch of different factors, right? Also, the resistance. A lot of variance, much higher than normal variance in a lot of factors. And I realized from looking at this data that a whole bunch of that variance was from games in which people played as teams. Because the way that I originally wrote my factor groups, I didn't clearly differentiate between games in which other players are your teammates or in which all players are opponents. And so the people, my experts, self-identified experts, when they were scoring it, some of them interpreted it in different ways, and it gave me a whole bunch of variability. So as a result of this, I went back and I wrote and I explained better how each thing should be scored in the case of playing on a team instead of as a solo player. So those are the columns. If you look at the rows, you can see that there were certain attributes which were very contested. So attention was one. There isn't a huge variation, but it varied on almost every single game, right? So some things, construction and allegiance, people understood how to score that pretty well, other than on the cases of these columns. But some things, the descriptions weren't clear enough that people were always giving the same sort of score. So that tells me about which of these metrics that I had come up with would be well applied, right? You want to make sure that if you ask somebody a question with something that's supposed to be an inherent property of the game, you want to make sure that people are giving you the same answer, that they understand, oh, if you have a game and a bunch of people say that, oh, that's a 2 of malice, but some people say, oh, that's a 3 in malice, that's not good. To be a useful metric, people need to be able to clearly identify and agree on what the value should be, right? So, great. So that's that. This is, let's see, what else here? So this is just a live look at my Google Sheets where I'm doing a lot of this analysis. So I don't know which of these are especially exciting. This is the best. This is the prettiest graph. I've got the most colors on this one, so I like that one a lot. Well, so I guess what we should talk about is factor analysis, right? Because that's the next step in my process, is I subjected my data results to factor analysis. So that's a little bit of a fancy thing. So this is RStudio. So this is a statistics package and graphing and data manipulation tool. So factor analysis is often used in sort of machine learning algorithms. And within factor analysis, you come up with the idea that there's going to be clusters. I was saying earlier, I was waving my hands and saying there's going to be clusters. There's going to be certain people who are kind of like clustered like this, people who all have something in common, right? But the question is, what are those clusters? What is it that people have in common? And factor analysis allows us to come up with the groupings, interestingly, without actually knowing what is the quality that determines what group somebody is in, right? In fact, it's just math, right? You're just running the math. So this first graph that I have up here is the parallel analysis screen. And so this is showing, if I were to put everybody into one group, so give it a value of 1, well, that would be a perfect fit. If I said, this is the group of all the people who took my survey, that's a 100% fit, but it's also not useful. If I were to break people up into 2 groups, the eigenvalues, the curve fit would not be very good. But you get down here to about 4 or 5 groups, and it starts to be a really good fit. And in fact, if we go all the way to 40 groups, which is the number of numerical questions that I asked within my survey, I would have a perfect fit, which makes sense, right? If I said, these are the 40 questions that I asked people, that would fit everybody's answers. But you can see, right around 5, maybe 6, that's the ideal number of factors. So this tells me I'm looking for about 5 groups, right? And so that means that ideally, when I've finished this process, I should be able to say, here's the 5 things that you need to know. And if I tell you the answers to these 5 things, then almost everybody will have really important information that's going to help them make a good decision about whether or not they want to buy that board game. So, unfortunately, I don't have a graph or a clear thing that I can show you that explains how I get these 5 things. I can show you, I've got my correlation matrix here. Oh, actually, this is really interesting. Well, I think it's really interesting. I'm going to just be losing people as I talk, and I just get further and further into the math here. But those of you who enjoy this stuff, welcome. We should hang out. So this is a correlation matrix. So this is about how well each question's answers correlate with the answers to a different question. Okay? So if I were to ask about 20 things that were all completely orthogonal to one another, the correlation should be 0. However, I would hope that the correlation between each pair of questions would be simple. So this first column is, what's your ideal score for interpersonal, which is one of my metrics. And the second question is, what is your value? How much do you value that specific interpersonal score? So interpersonal and then V interpersonal. Malice, V malice. Investment, V investment, and so forth. There are 40 questions. And so I would hope that there would be some correlation. But you see here, interpersonal, how much does it correlate with how much they value it? Only 10%. So people's scores on interpersonal don't correlate very strongly with how much they value it. Similarly, malice here, so this 1.0, that means that the malice corresponds with malice, which is, of course, that's the identity. You can see here, corresponds to about 20%. Better. But now we go down to investment. Oh, investment corresponds at 3%. But clearly, people do not really care about investment, right? They have a preference, but how much do they care about it? Basically, not at all, right? They'll take any level of investment in a game, and this makes a lot of sense. Investment, I should explain. I told you already that I made up all these words to specifically not be used in their traditional way, so that you have no idea what they mean. So I should explain them as I talk about them. Investment is about whether a game can be set up quickly, and whether it's the sort of game that, like a maximum value investment would be Gloomhaven, right? Something that has a campaign, you're going to play it a lot, you got to really get into it, you got to understand the lore, and so things. A low investment is like apples to apples, right? Apples to apples, you can have people are sitting around playing. I can jump in, play 2 rounds, and just leave. No investment, right? I can play immediately. You don't even have to explain the rules to me before I play. Just sit down and you're like, oh, I'm going to start taking actions playing. So people have preferences about investment, but they were happy to play games of any level of investment. And that's because if it's a game that requires a lot of play, it's a game that you like, right? And if it's a game that doesn't require any level of play, you already know. You're like, well, I'm happy to play something that has low investment, but I'm happy to play high investment because I already wouldn't play it unless I thought I was going to like it. So investment, although a useful thing to look at, is not something where people really care about where it falls on the scale. Okay. So taking this correlation matrix and then applying the factor analysis to it, get a bunch of values, and this is what I'm saying. This is not very interesting to look at, but I will just jump to the end, and I'll tell you what I came up with as the five factors, the 5 questions. If I tell you the answers to these questions, everyone's going to have a pretty good understanding of whether or not the game is the kind of game that they will enjoy. Okay? So the 5 factors were malice, which I went over in detail at the beginning. Fiddliness. Fiddliness is a metric of, so it's about accessibility. Do you need to have good dexterity? Is there a lot of pieces to move? Do things get knocked off the board easily or not? Can you play it on a ship where things are rocking back and forth like cribbage? Are there a whole bunch of different decks? Does it take a whole long time to set it up and tear it down? That's fiddliness, right? So a lot of people really like fiddliness or low fiddliness, and people really care about where fiddliness scores. So malice, fiddliness. Brilliance is one of my categories, which is how much opportunity is there to do something surprising, to do something that, oh, I didn't think you were going to be able to come back, but you had a huge turn and you came back really big, right? So if the game is very predictable, if it's the sort of game that, we're halfway through and obviously no one's going to be able to beat the leader, that's a low brilliance game. But if there's a big opportunity to do something clever, that's high brilliance. Then instability, which is about how much can the game swing, right? If I'm looking at how many points somebody has or how many cards they have, is there something I can look at, and does that give me a good idea about who's going to win the game? Low instability means that I can absolutely tell who's winning at every time. High instability means I have no idea. Anything could happen. Okay? Instability is something people care about a lot. And the last one is actually, it was not any of my things, but it's a kind of a merge. It's a combination of 2, which was interdependence and allegiance. Those are very similar. They both have to do with how you interact with other people, and how much you care about how well other people are doing within the game. So a game with low interdependence means that I can have a really good game and really get into it and be satisfied, even if other people are kind of phoning it in, right? And high interdependence is a game where if other people are not as excited and invested as I am, the game is terrible, right? Social deduction games are a great example. If we're playing Secret Hitler, and I'm like really, really into it and being really careful about all my votes and really thinking about it, and someone's just like, whatever, just voting randomly, that's not going to be, that's a high interdependence game playing with somebody who doesn't care. So malice, fiddliness, brilliance, instability, and allegiance, interdependence. Those are the 5 factors. With those 5 questions, you get the most information for the most types of people. So that's my result from all my analysis. So now let me tell you, because the story continues. My original idea was that once I had these results, I'd put up a website and get some little graphics, get some SVGs, and push them out and say, hey, board game developers, board game publishers, here's a great little graphic you can put on the side of your box that has 5 values, and these 5 values will really help people decide whether or not your game is a good fit for you. That was great. I'm making the world better, not charging for this. They can always score it themselves. Just a little graphic you can put on the side of your box. How great. However, I have had quite a bit of trouble getting anyone to be excited about this. And actually, I should say, it's very nice. I've had several publishers discuss this at length with me, go back and forth. They haven't been non-responsive. They've actually been very interested. However, their goals are not well aligned with my goals, because publishers, understandably, want to know what sort of games will people like, and how can I convince people to buy my game. And the nature of my research is actually completely antithetical to that, because I'm not saying that there's any value that is better or worse. In fact, I'm specifically looking at things where all points on the spectrum are really useful values, right? Malice, 0 Malice, 4 Malice are both really good games. There isn't like 3 is the proper place that Malice should be at. But also, I'm not doing anything that's going to convince someone to buy the game. The whole point of my project here is to give people information that they would get when they play the game, and give that information to them before they play the game. Right? So this is making them more informed, right? I've now got a better informed decision. But that doesn't help publishers, right? Publishers want to sell more games. They don't want to successfully let people know that they shouldn't buy a game ahead of time. And I understand that. But it's not what I want. And so this is where I am. I've got these factors. This is not actually my main area of research within my dissertation. This is just something that I was doing on the side because I'm a huge board game nerd, and I thought I should use my powers for good. I'm a little bit stuck now, right? I have all this research, I have all this cool data, I have this project. I want to share it with the world, but I'm not sure how I can usefully share it, right? Because just letting people know that these factors exist and that it would be useful doesn't really do anything. That's just hypothetical. That's not making the world better. Finding partners, finding publishers who are interested in promoting this is really, I feel like, an important next step. But although I'm a huge board game enthusiast and I have some contacts within the board game world, mostly I'm a video game designer and developer. There are different worlds. There isn't a whole lot of overlap all the time. Anyway, that's where I am. That's the analysis I've done. I think it's been really interesting. I'm not sure what the future for that could be. Yes, that's that. We are only 35 minutes in, but I've explained all the things that I have to explain. That was probably quite a lot. I would love to have people who have questions or suggestions or hurl insults at me or tell me that I'm doing the wrong project or the right project or anything like that. Mickey, have there been any questions that have come through in the Twitch chat? Because I don't see that. Oh, I must have done it wrong then. Absolutely. Yes. So that's interesting. I mean, everything is true, right? Language is complex. So I don't have the question in front of me, but if you want to say, what's the right thing that's a better fit for an attribute? Well, right there, by using the word attribute, that means that you have an idea of something in your head that you're already trying to fit to, right? You're already trying to match to something that you already have in your head, which is very useful. That's how we describe all kinds of things, right? And I talk about a color. I want to match something to my idea of what that color is, and I could maybe define a wavelength on the spectrum and say this is the color and this is not. That's not really how people use language. This is why doing a sociological regression study, looking at sort of like a root mean squared or some sort of variance or a curve fit, is always going to give you a better result than trying to match to an attribute, some concept that you already have. Also very interesting, I'll just go off on a tangent here, people have a lot of words that they use to describe games, right? So I'm talking about video games now, right? Because I've put out a lot of big video games that have millions of players, and I'm on the forums, and people talk with me, and they have a lot of opinions. So especially within video games and board games as well, there are so many more players than there are creators, right? And so the language that builds up around board games, around video games, the language is a player-centric language, right? Which makes perfect sense because players want to communicate with other players. However, the language that is useful to a player is not very representative of how the thing is built, or of how the thing has been put together, or what the considerations are of the thing, right? Also, I made the funny example earlier, like if I was looking at games and I was going to rank them according to number of letters in their title, right? So that's something that's an example of sort of a player-centric thing, because I can easily write down the titles of a bunch of games and sort them according to the number of letters in that title. That doesn't really get to the thing, and the attributes that are most popular and that get widely used and disseminated and that people talk about, those attributes are not successful in that social space because they are good at describing a thing. They're successful because they are clear. They are successful because people can use them and use them in the same way as one another. For example, deck building. Okay, people who are board game enthusiasts will almost certainly think they are like, oh, I have a clear idea of what deck building means. Okay, I'm going to say that for me, deck building means is the game like Dominion. Okay, because Dominion sort of created this idea of deck building, and so whether or not something is deck building pretty much is the same question as how much is it like Dominion. But mathematically, the things that Dominion was doing were already being done. There were lots of games that were already doing the same mathematical thing that Dominion was doing, but Dominion was doing it with cards. Dominion gave you a different way to see it and recognize it. So now, because it's been socialized by Dominion, a lot of people have this idea, they're like, oh, I got that, I understood it, it made sense. Like in music, major or minor key, right? Those are just descriptions, right? A key is not a real thing. That's just a description of kind of how it sounds and how it puts together. And we put together definitions for what is major and what is minor, what's Phrygian or Mixolydian. And once that's defined, then you can go back and look at other things and like, oh, this other thing also fits that idea. But you're just fixing it to an attribute. So to get back to the question, trying to better fit an existing attribute, for me, isn't really useful because the attributes are already focused on successfully using the language and not about whether or not they are successfully describing something that is an important consideration for the player. Here we go. I'm sure we could discuss that at length, but that's my soapbox statement about that. What else you got for me, Vicky? Absolutely. Yep. Also, I probably should have said this at the head. You can follow me on Twitter. It's at Mr. Simon Strange. That's my name, Simon Strange. So that's a good way to get in touch with me. Also, I am pretty easy to find. If you just look around for Mr. Strange, Simon Strange, you will find all kinds of links to me, my emails, and other things that I'm doing. Some of them will be hate mail. That's a thing that will happen because of my job. But I'm definitely pretty easy to find. Twitter is a good way to get access to me directly. But I will try to get some links out in the breakout channel as well after once we're done with the main presentation here. Yeah. Correlation factors. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So Board Game Geek is a great source because of the existing attributes people have identified that I think are not very descriptive of play, but are still very useful mechanically, and there's lots of good research being done with them. Um, Great thing about Board Game Geek is that you have that sort of user created content. Like I had to get a bunch of experts to score these 100 games to make sure that they were that these metrics could be well used. But that took like a month of time for me to find 20 people who were willing to help me out with that. But once you publish this in Board Game Geek, you've got the mob, you've got thousands of people who will just go through and help create all the rankings, which will let people sort of like sort and analyze things by these numbers. That's absolutely something that I want to do. I guess maybe it was wrong of me to sort of do this have a publisher first model because I'm in the video game publishing sort of like industry. I thought I could reach those people, but maybe it is a better idea to start at Board Game Geek and make these factors that people are already familiar with there, and then try to move it on to being on the physical boxes. That's a totally valid way to approach it, and it wasn't something that I had. I definitely had it in the other order in my head, but maybe I should rethink that. Oh, I should have been repeating your questions. Okay. Let me just repeat that. So Nikki has just informed me that you all can't hear him when he speaks, and we thought you could hear him. So he's been reading off questions to me, and then I've been answering them. But apparently, my answers maybe haven't made any sense because unless I encapsulated or repeated the question, you just heard me go quiet for a while and then speak. So I apologize for that. So let's see. The first question was about whether creating more attributes and doing a cross-reference across them would match to existing attributes. The second thing was about whether I was using it was about what kind of factor analysis I was using. I forget what the questions were, but there was just a straightforward answer. And then the most recent question was about whether I should socialize these factors on Board Game Geek before getting them on boxes, or if I should get them on boxes before going to Board Game Geek. And I had only been focused on the second, and someone pointed out correctly that maybe the first way would be a better avenue. So that's a great example. And apparently, those are all the questions that have been written in the chat thus far. So we still have about 10 minutes here. We can end it early, or if people want to write out more questions in the chat, we can do that. I can see my device has been going off, so I can see a bunch of people are pinging me on Twitter now, so I guess that's been successful, and I'll probably have a bunch of questions to answer on there. So put more questions in the chat, or you can meet me in the, what is there's another Discord channel. Tell me what to say, Mickey. It's the panelist hangout in the Discord channel is where I'll be hanging out after this to talk with people in real time. Oh, So zones of connection, Discord. There's a panelist hangout in there. Zones of connection. Just like, wait. Great. Well, I think that's all I had to say. I'm very excited to talk about this. I've been working on this project, like I said, for over a year. So anybody who's excited to help me with it or has ideas about how I can keep socializing this and bringing it forward, or maybe has some quibbles with my mathematical models, all those things would be great. I'd love to talk about all those things. So I think we can just cut off there.